We continue our series today on how we can develop spiritual resilience so that we can build better community. And today I wanted to look at the power of humility. Humility is the absence of arrogance. It's the ability to move the focus off of ourselves and center on other people. And so in talking about humility, first I just briefly want to talk about what it's not, because it's often very confused with other things. And then I'm going to talk about three characteristics of humility that I think we can apply in our life and will be critical for us as we try to build community and engage in the public square in these challenging times. So let's get started. Let's look briefly at what it's not, but often people think is. Humility is not about keeping your mouth shut, keeping your head down, and it's not about becoming a doormat for other people. Many Christians feel like that's what it's interpreted as. And this view of humility, where you're just sort of somebody that people can just step on, has allowed many spiritual people, many church people, to be manipulated actually by dark forces, because they know that they can appeal to that message of humility and they can get their way. I found this quote from this Dr. Vicky Zaroweski, the education director at the Greater Good Science Center. And she described the challenge of being humble in our time. And she said, "Why is it so challenging for us to express humility? It's often because we misinterpret it as an active demonstration of a sign of weakness, when it is an indication of tremendous inner strength." So I thought that was a great quote, and not understanding humility can lead to some dangerous outcomes. One lesson we've seen in our own denomination is the story of the Boston Church. In our video today for our music, we saw the Wayfarers Chapel, and now I'm talking about another church, the Boston Church. And it sits right on top of Beacon Hill. And in fact, I believe it was at least the 60s, maybe the 50s, that Dr. Malcolm Peck's father was a leader in the church and helped convert an old church into a high-rise building. And the revenue from that high-rise building on the top of Beacon Hill has generated large amounts of money for the church located on the first floor. And eventually, in the 2000s, a local mobster, that's right, a mafia guy named Eddie McKenzie, smelled the money. He was one of Whitey Bulger's gang. And seeing the opportunity, he pretended to be interested in the church's teachings. So he joined, his wife joined, and they started appealing to the humility, the so-called humility in the congregation. And within a year, that church was taken over by a mafia. The denomination sued and lost in court over the building, and it was only freed from him when the DEA smashed through the doors to arrest him for drug trafficking. The story is written up in the Boston Globe in a 2010 article called "Gods and Monsters." And it has this quote, which is where I get really concerned about this false humility of letting people just walk over you. There's a quote from a member of the church that said, "He was such a nice guy. He was as nice as he could be." Remembers one church member. "He complimented older female congregants on how beautiful they looked. He often snapped to attention when a veteran passed the hallway, delivering a quick salute. He volunteered to help with the weekly Sunday luncheons. Soon, the convert was winning converts of his own. It helped that McKenzie was seen as someone who could bring new life to an aging place." So believing that they were being humble, they sort of went along with this guy, and they failed to see the danger. So I want to really stress that that is not humility. It is not rolling over for particularly people who prey on those situations. It's more complicated. And so now I want to shift to what humility really is and how it manifests itself, and why I think it's such a critical element in building community, and particularly for our polarized times. The first characteristics of a truly humble person is their ability to empty themselves of their selfishness and ego. None of us can get rid of all of it, but they really do a better job. You might remember last year I did one of those dialogue sermons with a young guy named Ryan Nakade, who's a mediator that I really admire, young guy. And he's really good at mediating very complex situations. He's recently been working in situations with the alt-right, for example. So I've been super impressed with his skill set, how he does it. So I asked him about where he got that ability to kind of come into these dialogues. And he shared that from his Buddhist training, he had learned to empty himself of ego in going into these exercises. And that had served him really well. And it's true, he's a good mediator, but he's a very humble person. And humility is that act of emptying ourselves, that it's not all about us. We begin to develop the ability to see the world through the eyes of others. Again, I'm going to keep stressing, this doesn't mean we blind ourselves to people who have evil intentions. Of course, when we encounter that, we must act. But humility gives us the ability to see the world through another's eyes. When Jesus teaches in the Sermon on the Mount, in the text that we read today, that blessed are the poor in spirit, he's speaking about the ability to empty ourselves of ego in service to others. In the following line, he says in a more modern way, whoever wants to be a leader must be a servant. In the same way, I came into the world not to be taken care of, but to take care of others. So that is a beautiful understanding of emptying ourselves from Ryan and the text from Jesus. Another way I like to describe it is that shift is the one we used in the newsletter this week, a quote from the famous author C.S. Lewis. And he said, humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. So it's a little shift in focus and centering. That leads me to the second attribute of being humble, which is becoming curious. One of the great things about little kids, and also one of the most annoying things about little kids, is they are so curious. So when you're talking to a kid who's just figuring out the world, what do they always say? Why? It can be exhausting. Why do I have to go to bed? Why is there winter? Where is the sun? Why? Why are you older than me? Why? They're constantly asking questions and trying to make sense of things. They are incredibly curious. But at some point, we stop asking why. We stop asking questions because we kind of think we figured it out. I know in my own life, when I had that epiphany, it was 5th grade. I had realized that I had learned everything that was possible to learn in 5th grade. I knew math, I knew English, I knew history, and I just couldn't imagine what more there was to learn. I was done with why. I kind of had it all figured out. Well, sadly, we go into our adult lives and we stop asking. We stop being curious. Jesus tells us in the passage that we read today that we must be childlike in our curiosity. When the crowd is trying to keep young kids away from him, they want to sit on his lap, they want to meet him, and they think, he's a very important person, he can't be bothered with children. He uses that moment as a chance to teach, saying, don't stop these kids from coming to me, because their curiosity actually represents a healthy spiritual life. And we have to get back into that childlike mentality where we're still curious and we're still wondering and we're still humble. Humble people have developed the ability to get outside themselves, and they have a real ability to understand the worldviews of others. When they're faced with a person with whom they disagree, they resist the temptation to cancel, label, or write off, but instead they shift into curiosity. How could that person believe that? And they don't mean it in a condescending like, how could you believe that? It's, how could they believe that? And not assuming they're a bad person, I wonder how they came to that. It's a beautiful exercise. You may remember that we hosted a book party at the church last year with the Rumi Forum, who had sponsored the author Monica Guzman. And she wrote an incredible book last year, which I really encourage all of us to read, called I Never Thought of It That Way: How to Have Fearlessly Curious Conversations in Dangerously Divided Times. In the book, Guzman brilliantly speaks to bridging the gap in our culture, and she starts with her Latino, first-generation immigrant, Trump-supporting father. The strategy she recommends is curiosity. Be curious. During her presentation, one of the phrases that she said that jumped out to me, and I asked a question about it later, was this. She said, "Not only do I now understand why my parents supported Trump, but I've also come to see that if I had their experiences, I probably would too." That was being very humble. Humility offers us the chance to see the world through another person's eyes, and at the same time hold our own sincerely held views. It's not giving up our worldview. It's holding our worldview and seeing it through another person's eyes. And curiosity is the pathway for that. The third element of humility is becoming less judgmental. The ability to see people with all their foibles and not feel a need to immediately condemn them is an act of humility. Yes, as I've pointed out at the beginning of the sermon, there's always going to be players out there who are going to seek to take advantage of others for their selfish and often nefarious agenda. And as I pointed out, we need to be clear in our boundaries. But we cannot confuse humility and not discerning between good and evil and people in our life. But we don't need to start there. Most people are not pathological narcissists, mob figures. But whenever I do bring up this topic with audiences, they always say something like, "So are you saying that I need to see the world through a Nazi's eyes?" It always is the Nazis. And my answer is that, how many Nazis have you really encountered or are you working with? I mean, if we're always talking about extreme examples and not really the people we're engaged with. But yes, we do have to deal with the Eddies, the mobsters, and the gangsters. But we cannot let ourselves stop there. We need to work with most people who have actually good intentions but disagree with us. It's not the reality of our country right now that we're all just divided by good people and evil people. Once we categorize everybody who disagrees with us in the evil category and write them off, there is no potential for any further insights or discussion, and the ability to be non-judgmental leads to us to be non-curious. People with deep humility live by the phrase that I love called, "But by the grace of God go I." You've probably heard the phrase, maybe you use it. I use it all the time. It just means that when I see somebody else who's doing something I don't approve of, you can just say to yourself, in a different circumstance, I might be making those same mistakes. And so I can be less judgmental. Very often we can see that we made those mistakes in our own life at different times, and we've been forgiven, so we forgive others. An interesting historical note is that phrase, "But by the grace of God go I," is attributed to a Protestant theologian in England named John Bradford in 1553. He saw a group of prisoners being taken away and announced, "But by the grace of God go I." He was probably quoting from the letter that we read from Paul today in Corinthians, where Paul says, "For I am the least of the apostles, not fit to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am." I think these are nice mantras. But by the grace of God, I am what I am. Or, but by the grace of God go I. Are reminders that we have our faults, we have our mistakes, and we've made mistakes in our own life. We don't need to quickly jump to condemnation of others. In a sad footnote, Bradford was himself burned at the stake a few years later when the royal family moved back from Protestant to Catholic. He was a Protestant theologian. But by the grace of God, we are what we are. And in different circumstances, not too far from our own life, we could be in the same situation. Like Monica Guzman talking about her Trump supporting father, humility allows us to see, maybe in a different situation, I might see it that way too. The ability to be humble is critical for working to bridge the divides in community and in the public square. Swedenborg in today's reading notes that people who lack humility always focus on themselves and eventually look at everyone else as the enemy. He could be describing the state of the United States today, where many of us feel under attack from everyone else and we feel they are the enemy. The humble perspective doesn't look at everyone who disagrees as an enemy. It allows people a chance to be seen, and it allows people a chance to be heard, and it allows for a chance to build bridges. I do love this quote from our fellow Swedenborgian pastor, Reverend Jung-Chel Lee in San Francisco, when he said, "Even though we're living in the same world, none of us are living in the same reality. That's why. When a person completely believes they're absolutely right, they automatically lose the ability to listen to the perspective of others." Humility is our guard against certainty. As we grow in our spiritual life, we can say to ourselves, the more I know I don't know. And this will be very critical. Our ability to gather in groups and disagree in politics and in just building civil society is becoming more and more challenging. And the spiritual power of humility in leaders will grow in importance. Humility, the ability to center yourself on others. It allows us to be curious when we meet those we disagree with, and it allows us to become less judgmental. The more we grow in our spiritual life, the more we come to realize that to be humble is one of the greatest spiritual superpowers. Amen.